Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you all for coming out. Good group for a return to the season already. Kind of crazy. I don't know where summer went. Blinked my eyes, and here we are back again. Cold weather in store for all of us soon. So we'll enjoy the nice weather while we still have it, right? Can still wear our shorts and such. Just a few quick updates and announcements. Thank you to everybody who has sent in their dues already. We have been getting them. I do have to apologize though. Some of you sent them in early in June, and it's been a while. We have transitioned bank accounts since Marty retired the treasurer position, and Larry took it over. We've transitioned to Coastal One Credit Union as our new bank account, and it took a little bit to do that. We were waiting on some paperwork from Al Smith and the folks up in Boston to finalize that. So that took a little bit longer than we were hoping for. So if you do have an uncashed check, thank you, Jack. It will be cashed very soon if it's not already cashed. And I do apologize for the hold up with that. We have been getting stuff to the P.O. box though, so folks are using the P.O. box, and we are getting all your information through the P.O. box. That's good news. Much more streamlined way of handling things, so thank you all for that. And if you have not paid your dues yet, Larry is in the back row here if you are ready to do so. $25 for individual, $30 for family.
Cash only.
Make sure it's a check, not cash. Just do it. Also, our holiday dinner is coming up in December too as well. More on that coming in the next newsletter, in the next flag bearer. We just finalized a price of $37, so the same as last year. The folks at Century House are great to us with that, so we'll be back at the Century House the second Tuesday in December, Peter?
December the 10th.
December the 10th. So more on that in the next newsletter as well. Tonight, we will have our newest board member speaking to us again in our series of generals we love to hate, or perhaps generals who got a bad rap over the course of time. So I'm excited for this one, hear a little bit more. One of my colleagues, I forgot to ask on Saturday before I left work, she has a Ben Butler chamber pot. So perhaps we'll talk, I don't know if we're going to go there tonight, but it is a chamber pot that has Ben Butler's face on the inside of it. So I was going to bring that tonight for this conversation and I forgot. But we are very honored and happy that Judge Michaud agreed to speak to us tonight. Retired colonel, judge, lawyer, a whole bunch of things, and now our newest member of our board. So we are very happy to have him here tonight to speak a little bit about Ben Butler, who was a lawyer himself too, right? So without any further ado, Judge Michaud, the floor is yours.
All right, so I'm here, I'm going to talk a little bit about another general that I think has been maligned over history, and undeservedly so in my opinion. At least that's my conclusion at the end of it. We'll examine Butler. I mean, there's a lot of things to be said about him, but I'll get into most of the details when I start talking about it. Next slide. All right, that's me in all my glory with my Colonel Kurtz supporters in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was one of my last duty stations when I was in the service. So, and they were a great bunch of guys. And we were going to take a picture, and it was like how many could crowd into the same picture with me as possible. So, anyways, but my background briefly: I got a BA in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I got my master's in history from Sam Houston State University down in Huntsville, Texas. So that was a cultural experience, an awakening for a young man from Massachusetts. I Juris Doctorate from the University of New Hampshire in Concord, and then I got a military science, a master's in military science at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Militarily, I retired as a lieutenant colonel after being the deputy commander of the 3rd LSO, which is Legal Support Organization. I had prior service in the Army Corps as a tanker and then as an intelligence officer. Served as an instructor at West Point, as an instructor with the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies, and I put parts unknown because that was pretty much anywhere on earth that they would send me, like places like here. And Deputy Commander, obviously, the 3rd LSO, and the Commander of the Alpha Company in the 126 MI. Civilian, I'm an Associate Justice, that's why I currently serve as a judge here in the Southeast Housing Court, reside in Dartmouth, and most importantly, I am a serious Civil War nerd, which is why I'm a member of this illustrious group. Next slide. So Ben Butler, by way of background, he was born in New Hampshire in 1818 in Deerfield, New Hampshire. As a very young, about 2 years old, his father died. His father was a seafaring man, and he was lost at sea. And so he was raised in Lowell. His mother moved to Lowell, where there were more economic opportunities, obviously, and he was raised by his mother and his grandmother, and had a older sister. So he had a very strong feminine upbringing, basically. And his mother wanted him to become a minister, and he did not want to become a minister. And so what talked her into going to Colby College with the promise that he would attend his religious studies while he was at Colby College, and he basically used the money he had was to pay the fines for not attending the religious services that they had at Colby College. So, lawyer, state legislator, congressman, presidential candidate, and later governor of Massachusetts. He was a very outgoing guy. People who met him generally, if you liked what he stood for, you liked him. He was, but if you didn't like what he stood for, you definitely would not like him, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Became a major general in the Union Army after some early successes. Served later after the war as the primary prosecutor of Andrew Johnson in the Johnson impeachment proceedings. Thaddeus Stevens was a big supporter, and the radical Republicans were big supporters of Butler. So he basically became the de facto leader based upon his success as an attorney. Strong supporter, and this is one thing I didn't know about him, where he was a very strong supporter of civil rights for African Americans, an early suffrage supporter, ladies. He was one of the guys that wanted women voting very early, and he founded or helped found Hampton College, which is a historically black college for African Americans to attend. Next slide. And then tap it twice. There you go. All right. One thing you could say about Ben Butler, he was never afraid of controversy. When he was at school, one of the people that he went to school with stated that he was a reckless, impetuous, headstrong boy who regularly got into fights. So you either agreed with him or you were going to be fighting him. A dogged and sharp lawyer who built a very successful practice. You can tap it one more time. You should be bringing some others up. Representing both mill workers and mill owners. And that's interesting because typically the twain never met. Back in those days, you either were a representative legally of the mill owners, which was sort of intent on beating down workers, or you represented mill workers, which basically was to try to get a rise in wages and living conditions. But he represented both and built a fortune doing it as a very successful attorney. Next, fought for and instituted the 10-hour workday. Now, I know it sounds silly today because we have the 8-hour workday, and in a lot of cases it's not even 8 hours now anymore. But back then, going from a 16-hour workday to an 8-hour work or 10-hour workday was a big drop in the number of hours that you were required to spend at the mill. Most of these people prior to him working for that would have spent basically their entire daylight hours working and then go home, eat, sleep, get up, and go back to working again. So he recognized that and he fought it. Next. Was instrumental in pushing through the Civil Rights Acts of 1871 and 1875, which sort of buttressed the 14th Amendment and ensured that African Americans had the rights to vote, legal rights to property ownership, and the same legal rights that every other citizen enjoyed. So he was very active in that. One of his things that he did was he appointed the first black state judge in Massachusetts and appointed Clara Barton as the first woman to basically serve in an executive position in state government in Massachusetts. So he appointed her to lead the Women's Reformatory in Massachusetts. Next slide. but he was known as a fighter and also as a very handsome devil. Um, but his, I was in my studies of him, I read Lieutenant General Richard Taylor of the Confederate States Army said, in the war of epithets, Butler has proven his ability to hold his ground against all comers. He wasn't afraid of taking on anybody. If he thought that he was in the right, he would stand up and he would tell you so. And he would organize and work without rest to try to defeat you. He was very highly regarded at the bar and regarded as someone, if he signed off on to oppose you in a trial, that you were basically going to be spending a lot of sleepless nights preparing for trial against Ben Butler, because he was very cagey when it came down to it. Next slide. Hit it again. There you go. Civil War record. So really why we're here is we want to talk about his generalship, okay, and what he did. And basically it falls into two parts. And when you look at it, there's his service as a general in a combat environment, and then his service as a military leader, as an organizational leader, and as a planner. When I finished up studying Butler, I think my end result, at least the conclusion that I drew, is that he would have been an excellent operations officer for a major command. Great planner, great in terms of putting all of the parts together. Those of you who remember me speaking about Burnside, what was one of the big things that ruined his campaign at Fredericksburg was the lack of getting the boats necessary to build the bridge across the river. Had Ben Butler been his S4, his supply officer, that never would have happened. He had an uncanny ability of anticipating and innovating and overcoming, adapting and overcoming, as we say in the military, which is a big positive trait, and he had that in spades. Next slide. Was he a good general? As a field commander, he was not particularly adept. When in charge, he was certainly not afraid to take the initiative and to be innovative and to certainly take charge of whatever type of operation that he was in charge and placed in command of. But he had some serious problems. A couple of them we'll talk about later on, but Big Bethel, the Battle of Big Bethel, the Bermuda 100 campaign, and Fort Fisher, with three campaigns, battles that he was involved with that he was not adept at military command. And so rather than trying to restructure and his service and make it more, to play more to his strengths, they basically just kept throwing him into these type of command positions, military command, which he willingly sought. I mean, he went after these combat commands, but in his mind, he definitely believed that he was a pretty good field commander. But as an organizer, administrator, and a planner, he was perhaps one of the best in the Civil War. He was an innovator and always open to change. And at the end, I find that he was probably the best political general that we had in the Civil War. I mean, we had quite a few of them, and most of them proved to be very inept, both at command and in organizing. But with Butler, we'll talk about some of his successes. So let's examine both of the roles. Situation in June of 1861, Washington was effectively cut off, and this is kind of hard to see, but that's Washington there, okay? Baltimore is up here. Baltimore connects to Washington. All the northern railroads dump into Baltimore, Richmond being down here. As we all know, secessionist mobs in Baltimore had basically taken over the community and cut the lines that were going to Washington, D.C. So Butler was ordered, after he had secured an appointment as a brigadier general of the volunteers in Massachusetts, was ordered to basically restore Washington's connectedness to the rest of the North. And he did an outstanding job with that. First, he watched what had happened when the 6th Massachusetts went through Baltimore and they were assaulted and mobbed, and he was waiting in Philadelphia. So he had the 8th Regiment with him, and he decided, well, I'm not going to go walking right into that, so let's take another look at that. Here it was, taking charge. But we'll see here later on, and I'll walk through that a little bit more. But the Maryland legislature was meeting to vote articles of secession, which means that if Maryland went over to the South, Washington would effectively have been completely cut off from the North. So it was significant. Massachusetts Governor Curtin, after a lot of political footwork by Butler, both in D.C. and in Boston, appointed him as the Brigadier General of Volunteers, which was great because they created these 2 new regiments and they were going to need certain materials, and Butler just happened to own a plant that made the kind of materials that were going to be needed for the uniforms. So he saw it as one of these ways, like, okay, I'll skate the edge of that, and I'll be in charge of these regiments, and guess what? We're going to purchase all the material for our uniforms from the Butler's own factory. But not illegal, just maybe a little iffy at that. But they put together basically the 6th and the 8th Mass along with the 7th New York, and that was he was set off under orders from General Scott to basically re-establish. So this is what happened basically. Next slide. The first steps, obviously, when you're in charge, you take charge, and he had no problem with that. He took charge. That's a picture basically of the secessionist riot in Baltimore with the 6th Mass. But anyways, like I said, he was sitting in Philadelphia and was getting ready to go to Baltimore, and he decided on his own, with no authorization from General Scott or Washington, to say, I'm not going to go walking right into that. I'm going to sail from Philadelphia to Annapolis, where the capital of Maryland is. He does that. They land in Annapolis. He takes his troops off of the ship, and the mayor of Annapolis comes out and says, nobody here will sell you any food. We're not interested in having you here. You should just get back on your boats and leave. And he said, well, that's okay. We have weapons. We don't need anybody to sell us any food. We'll find what we need through other means and methods. And so immediately they started selling him food because he was not going to have his troops go hungry. But he secured Maryland basically by threatening the legislature with arrest, and then he seized the state seal. No law could be made without the presence of the state seal. So by seizing that, taking that into his control, he blocked them, and then the threat of arresting them from voting for secession did a pretty good job. From there, he marched up to Baltimore, again without orders, and took over the local government there, declaring martial law in Baltimore. And I can imagine that General Scott and the rest of the DC staff were probably going like, holy cow, what is this guy doing? We told him to just take the train to Baltimore, and now all of a sudden he's taken the state capital and he's moved on to Baltimore. But he occupied it, seized control of the local government, beat down the secessionist movement, and basically his actions kept Maryland in the Union, which was critical in terms of us being able to maintain Washington as the capital. Restored rail service between Baltimore and DC, and then afterwards, as a reward, was chewed out by General Scott for his heavy-handedness and lack of orders, but he receives an appointment as a Major General of Volunteers as a result of his actions. Lincoln understood what he did, and he said, this is a guy who's not afraid to take the initiative and get this thing done. So he did that, and he was assigned as a reward to command Fort Monroe. But I found this quote by him. Here, I have no orders. I am carrying on the war on my own hook. I cut loose from my orders when I left Philadelphia. Not the type of language that I'm used to hearing, at least in my background with military stuff. But so keep that in mind. He saw something. He saw that action needed to be taken. He wasn't afraid to take the initiative. Next slide. And hit it. There he is. All right, so he gets over to Fort Monroe, and he takes command at Fort Monroe, right? The Confederacy seizes the seizure, basically, of Fort Monroe, which remained in Union hands the entire war as a direct threat on Richmond and Petersburg. So they immediately scramble and put together some troops under Beauregard, and Beauregard, better field commander, obviously, than Butler, sends troops forward, and they locate a camp about 8 miles outside of Fort Monroe in an attempt to draw Butler out. And he was successful. Butler put together a task force, set them out, and they met at, there were 2 battles, Big Bethel and Little Bethel, but Big Bethel was the one that was dispositive of the action. The problem that he had was he had an inexperienced command structure. He put together on paper what was a fairly decent plan, but it required night maneuver, which is very difficult to do. I don't know how many people in the military, in the Army, whenever you have to move at night, it's like moving through mud. Everything slows down and it's difficult. Communications, particularly before radios, exceedingly difficult. So, but it required a night maneuver that was too complex for his green soldiers to execute, and his commander that he had in charge. And a big thing that caught the eye of Washington is that Butler didn't go along and personally lead this expedition. So that kind of, the defeat there, while it reflected badly on the command of the general in the field, also reflected very badly on Ben Butler. So they were saying, you know, you should have gone there. And his commission as a major general, which had not been completely approved yet, was brought back up by Congress. And it was quite a battle that went on about him getting appointed as Major General. So finally it went through, and he did get his 2 stars, but he ended up having to do a lot of political footwork behind the scenes to try to bring that together and make it work. Next slide. Okay, some of the things that positive about it, again, innovative, right? When he's at Fort Monroe and he sends some troops out, there were escaped slaves that started to come out. They heard that the Union Army was nearby, so they escaped and they went running over there. And of course, you know, the slave owners showed up at the door and, we'd like our slaves back, and they pointed to the Fugitive Slave Act and said, you have to give them back to us. And Butler actually did a quick turn and said, well, no, I believe you're claiming that you're a sovereign nation, and I see nothing in the law that says I have to return slaves to some other sovereign nation. So beat it, these guys are contraband of war, and we're going to keep them. He never actually used the term contraband of war, but in effect, his policy became the earliest form of the Union Army taking slaves and not returning them and keeping them as basically contraband of war that could have been used by the South to help further their position in terms of battle. Lincoln, while he didn't agree with the analysis, he approved of the end conclusion, and Butler was not disciplined, and he never countermanded Butler's provision with respect to treatment of escaped slaves. So contrabands became a regular part of Union armies moving throughout the South. And it depended on the command how welcome they were brought in. There were a lot of northern generals that didn't want to have anything to do with contraband escaped slaves, but there were a lot that said, yeah, come on, just get him behind, or they put him to work. Butler, to his credit, took many of them and put them to work and paid them wages. The first wages that some of them had ever earned in their lives. But they were doing a lot of the work that, you know, digging trenches and helping to reinforce positions and things of that nature, cooking, servicing, other, you know, things that the Army needed, and did a pretty good job for it. So I give them credit for that. You know, I give them credit for that. Next slide. Okay, so after Fort Monroe, he's called upon to lead another military operation, which works out well for him this time. Cape Hatteras and Redemption, basically. And he was called upon to lead a joint operation to secure Cape Hatteras as a jump-off point for Burnside's later attacks in that area. After initial difficulty with landings and trying to coordinate between naval and Army assets, they overcame, and they moved aggressively and captured the rebel forces and forts at the inlet. And what was important about this from a strategic perspective is we were just coming off of Bull Run, which had basically let all of the air out of the Union in terms of how they were viewing the war. So this was the first Union victory after the Battle of Bull Run. It got him a lot of publicity, redeems Butler in the eyes of Lincoln and the War Department, and it basically gets him another assignment of command. Next slide. New Orleans. This is probably what most people think about when they think about Benjamin Butler, Spoon's Butler, Beast Butler, and all of the things that happened in New Orleans. And you'd have thought that he had gone in there and burned the place to the ground or something of that nature. But actually what was going on is that New Orleans had fallen, and it was a complete chaos and disorder. You had secessionists that were running through the cities, people were being killed, there was no law, there was no order, disease was rampant, people were starving. So he came in and tried to restore order to that. One of the first things he did, as any good administrator is he took an assessment of what the public health was in the situation. New Orleans at that time had been suffering yellow fever on a regular basis, and many times they'd lose up to 5% of their population through yellow fever deaths. And so what he did was he hired a lot of unemployed people who didn't have any money and couldn't feed their families, and he put them to work cleaning streets, cleaning out sewer disposals, washing things down, quarantining people that were ill or that looked like they were going to be ill. And what happened was it reduced the number of deaths from 1,700 the year before to 2 the year after that Butler took charge. So he really improved the public health of New Orleans while he was there, and reduced deaths dramatically and restored some order. He broke up criminal gangs that were running the city basically at that point, and he stamped out any insurrectionist groups that still remained in there. Next slide. Okay, and hit it again. All right, so this is what everybody hears about when they hear about this. It was General Order Number 28. They refer to it as the Women's Order. And what had been happening was when Union troops and officers were walking around in the course of their duties in New Orleans, many of them were being spat upon, yelled at, sworn at by a lot of the women and the ladies that remained in New Orleans. In fact, David Farragut was waiting in his carriage underneath a portico, and a woman came out and dumped her chamber pot on top of Farragut. So Butler heard about that and said, okay, that's it. And so he came up with the order that said if any woman should insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she may be treated similarly to a woman of the town, applying her avocation. Woman of the town being a woman of lower virtue. And that set off all kinds of problems with the South and the troops. But the end result was, and Butler didn't care, frankly. I mean, his job was, hey, my job is to make sure that my troops and my officers and people here are going to be protected from these folks just taking these wild pot shots at them, spitting at them, swearing at them on the street, treating them with contempt and disrespect. So there was an immediate cessation of rude and abusive behavior. It was another point for the South to use in rallying against Butler, and that's when it became Beast Butler, which was a persona that was created by his old friend P.G.T. Beauregard, who referred to him as Beast Butler. And then Spoon's Butler also emerged because he had seized a 38-piece silver set from a woman allowed to leave with only clothing and personal effects. I guess she was being allowed to evacuate to go to another part of the South. And they said, fine, if you want to leave, you can take your clothing and some personal effects. And I think she had a wagon loaded with silver and had that kind of stuff. So it was seized, and then they said, oh, he's stealing silver and things of that nature. Now, there's a lot of smoke about that. And where there's smoke, there's usually some fire. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. One of the other things that he did there was anybody who was not taking a loyalty oath could have their cotton and property seized. And property seizures were regular if they found that somebody wouldn't take the oath of allegiance to the United States, and he would order all of their property seized and auctioned off. And who would show up to win most of those auctions? But his brother, Andrew Jackson Butler, who was also in his command. But he would show up and he would bid at these auctions, and he was able to buy a lot of these items at very low prices. Basically, there was no market. People didn't have any money. And so his brother swooped in and was able to get that. Over here is one of the famous chamber pots. You can see our hero's face on the bottom of it, courtesy of the women and folks of New Orleans, which is funny. And that's you should bring it next time, Mark. People will probably like seeing that. But other things that he did, he censored secessionist newspapers. He came in, and if a newspaper was being pro-secessionist, he'd shut it down. That was it. You were either going to only print things that were going to be informative and pro-union, or you're not going to print anything at all. A lot of the ministers in the South would use the pulpit to preach in support of the Southern secessionist movement, and so his response was, if you're doing that, you're closed. Go somewhere else. And so he would shut them down. He hired unemployed locals, who were generally people that would be prone to do anything for money, including bad ends or rob people and things. He hired them and put them back to work cleaning and flushing the streets, which we talked about earlier. He taxed the wealthy 25% to support the poor and orphans. So if you had money in New Orleans, he just said, okay, we're going to do an assessment of what you have, and we're going to tax you 25%. we're going to use that money not only to support poor and orphans, but basically pay these people. And it ended up that he was supporting 25% of the population in New Orleans with this tax, and it didn't cost the federal government anything. I'd like to get somebody like that doing some work for us today. Would probably be pretty good, but that's not bad. There was a gentleman, William Mumford, who led a group of individuals, and they climbed the Custom House Tower and tore down the U.S. flag, cut it up into pieces, and then it was a badge of honor to be wearing that walking around New Orleans. Butler found out who was behind it. William Mumford had been the leader of the group, so he had him tried and he had him hung, executed. Okay? So you hear that and you say, wow, how could he do that? You know, this guy was but he also supported Mumford's widow for the rest of her life. He sent her money regularly until she died. So he didn't have any heart, but he said, I cannot allow someone to do that to the flag and to have no repercussions from it. So after that, there were no more flags being torn down, and nobody, all of those little pieces of the flag that were being pinned on their jackets were quickly dispensed with. So that never happened. He formed the first black regiment in the U.S. Army, the first Louisiana National Guard from African Americans that he freed while they were there. He came in. So he was hailed highly in the North. The North read it about his exploits in New Orleans, and they thought it was great, as probably most people in the North would have. You know, we think that he's being tough with these folks that have been causing this, that started this war from their perspective. And he was absolutely despised in the South, so much so that Jefferson Davis put a bounty on his head, basically, that should he ever be captured, he was to be hung as basically a war criminal. But the amazing thing is that I found out afterwards, when he left New Orleans, he was reassigned, there were a lot of people in New Orleans that actually lived there. They were very disappointed. They actually wanted him to come back, because he had done such a good job restoring order out of chaos and improving the function of New Orleans and in its government so that it was a safe place in which to live and work. So that was funny. You read a lot of letters and people that wrote to members of the Army staff and stuff saying, geez, General Butler would be welcomed back to New Orleans. And it's sort of like that runs completely counter to what we've learned about him, at least, you know, what we've heard over the years, was that, you know, they couldn't wait to get rid of him. So, next slide. So he's rewarded with his service in New Orleans, and it's 1863, early 1864, so Lincoln has got another election that he's got to worry about, and Butler, being a leading Democrat of the day, it's his way of trying to keep this guy from running for president against him, or otherwise working to defeat Lincoln in 1864. So a political decision, most likely. So they give him the Army of the James over the objections of, I think it was Grant at the time, did not want Butler anywhere near him, because he knew that he was sort of a maverick and would tend to do things what he wanted to do. But they give him the Army of the James, and his popularity in the North requires management of him. So that's what Lincoln does. He says, I'm not going to get rid of him. But while he's got the Army of the James, he creates 6 regiments of what they called galvanized Yankees. Anybody heard that term before? And these were Southerners who had deserted and didn't want to go back to a prisoner of war camp or anything, so he'd have them swear an oath, and he created these regiments of galvanized Yankees, what they called the Southerners that had fought, and they sent them out to the western frontier so that the troops out on the western frontier could come back east, and these guys would be out, and the only people that they would be engaged in any type of battle with would have been Native American Indians at the time. So, which I thought was a good thing to do. I was unaware of that. I did not know galvanized Yankees. When I saw the term, I was like, wow, okay. So again, there he is, he's being innovative. He said, I got all of these guys that are flooding towards us that is, they're giving up. What am I gonna do with them, Let's use them some way that we can use them creatively and help buttress our forces here. So he does that on his own volition. He also, because New York City, with the draft riots in 1863, and generally, it were probably more secessionists in New York City than there were in New Orleans, from what I understand, but he was sent with 3,500 troops in 1864 to oversee the election, to make sure that there weren't any riots that would have upset any of the voting process. Lincoln trusted him at least enough to give him that duty, which was important because it was a close run affair between Lincoln and Mr. Richards here of McClellan, so could have gone either way for a while there. But he also creates several U.S. colored troop regiments that are sent, who serve honorably in the Bermuda 100 campaign, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But again, as overall, as commander of the Army of the James, great organizer, does a lot, restores morale, innovator, does things, galvanized Yankees, forms U.S. colored troop regiments, things of that nature. But as a field commander, again, we're going to find out that he's somewhat wanting. Next slide.
In the picture, which one is Butler?
This is just some members of his senior staff
Oh,
that were there. I saw it was a nice colorized photo. I said, all right, those guys are Army of the James. So we threw those guys in there. The Bermuda 100 campaign, or one of those little backwater campaigns, a lot of people, anybody really familiar with the Bermuda 100 campaign? Because I'll be honest, I wasn't. But when I got into it, I found out that he came perilously close to ending the war. But because of his inabilities to act decisively as a field commander, it ended up, he missed the opportunity. But what had happened was Grant basically said, look, we want you, when the overland campaign, we're going to keep Lee tied up. We want you to go in, we want you to try to go after Richmond and Petersburg primarily, cut off the supply lines, things of that nature. So he was ordered to land at the Bermuda 100, which is an area along the James River, to attack Petersburg and sever Richmond's supply lines. And the landing was a complete success, and they were basically arrived. He had a significant body of troops that were ready to go. Richmond was very lightly defended, and had he decided on that moment in time to let's just march right on Richmond, they probably would have been able to march right into Richmond. It was so undefended because most of the troops were up with Lee, shoring up whatever defenses he had against Grant in the overland campaign. So despite that intelligence, Butler did his, and that gives the Confederate forces time to gather and establish strong defensive positions. So he missed a chance to attack undefended Richmond. By the time he does get organized, the Confederate forces are in place. So he orders an attack, and they're decisively repulsed and driven back, which is, you hate to see lost opportunities like that. And I sort of, I fault Butler to a degree. He was in command, but then I found out that he had two Westport Corps commanders who didn't like him, and basically were working to rule as far as their command was going. They each had independent corps commands under Butler. Either one of them could have seized the opportunity and moved forward, but they decided to cross their arms and sit and wait for orders while Butler was trying to filter through. So I'm not going to mention their names. They're in the book, but I'm very disappointed that you'd see officers that hate their commanders so much, they're willing to allow an opportunity like this to be missed and cause another year of the war to drag on. So, next slide, please. So it brings us finally to the Fort Fisher fiasco. Butler loses face with Grant, so Grant is just like, I got to get this guy out of here. He's bottled up in the Bermuda 100, and great, now he's not doing anything to help the war effort. So they decide that they're going to go after Fort Fisher. Now, Fort Fisher is right at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, and was the path that you had to go through to get to Wilmington, which was the last port that was open for the Confederacy, in which they could get supplies from overseas. So it was critical, and it was well defended. They called it and referred it as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and they had a Colonel Lamb that had been in charge there, and when he showed up, it was just a series of sand mounds, but he was an engineer of West Point trained, and basically constructed some pretty significant forts and gun emplacements along there that made it very, very a powerful position. So Butler arrives, he goes down there and with joint naval operation, working with Admiral, wasn't Farragut, who was the other admiral?
Dixon?
What's that?
Dixon?
No, it'll come to me. I forgot, I should have put his name up there. But anyways, they come down and he looks at the forts, they shell them for a little while, and Butler says, you know what, this is what we should do. Let's pack a barge full of gunpowder, and then we'll just sail that out and push it off towards the walls of the fort, explode 300 tons of gunpowder, and see what happens, right? And yeah, Porter, Dixon Porter. So you would think that Admiral Porter would say, well, maybe not, but after going back and forth, he finally says, well, it might work. Let's give it a shot. So they do. They basically send the gunpowder boat down there, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, Porter had moved all his boats out. They sailed out about 12 miles because they weren't sure how big of an explosion this was going to be, which I was like, 12 miles out at sea is pretty far, but it explodes and it does literally no damage at all. So it was just like a great fireworks show for the guys that were in the fort, and they were like, boom, wow, that was nice, okay, what's next? So anyways, and at that point, acting without orders, again, Butler declares the fort is impregnable and withdraws without authorization. That ticks off Grant. And now this is after the election of 1864. So Lincoln no longer needs to keep Butler at bay, and he decides, you know, General Grant, it's your decision. You make the decision what you want to do. So he's recalled by Grant and embarrassingly relieved of his command. And he's arguing all the way, there's no way that that fort would fall. It never will fall. It's impregnable. It's just like that. So he goes to Washington, D.C. to try to set up hearings to defend his reputation and his battle plan and everything. And then his successor commander takes Fort Fisher about a week later after shelling it and then landing with forces. So kind of took some of the steam out of Ben's defense of his actions that day when it fell about a week after. But that was big, and that completed the Anaconda effect, and there was no longer any significant supplies being delivered to the Confederacy once Fort Fisher fell in January 1865. Next slide. So post-bellum, he got out and ran his businesses. Again, he owned mills, he owned mining operations, he owned property, he acquired. He was a good businessman. And he was worth $7 million, which is the equivalent of $240 million when he died. So the guy had a means and methods of making some money. Significantly, he argues ex parte Milligan before the United States Supreme Court in an attempt to be able to prosecute Lee and others with the military tribunals. And the Supreme Court came back and said, basically that the use of military tribunals when civilian courts are available is unconstitutional. So he loses at the Supreme Court, but that was his goal. His goal was to basically open up an avenue in which leaders of the Confederacy could have been tried by military tribunals and hung for treason. Losing that, he runs for Congress. He gets elected to Congress 4 times, despite his support for women's suffrage, paper currency, Civil Rights Act, of 1871, which outlawed basically the KKK, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which opened up public accommodations to all people equally. So conservative public that he represented, but he was an effective politician. He ran and was a leader on those issues, which I didn't know. I had no idea that he was such a strong supporter of women's suffrage, but then when you think back about it, he was raised by women primarily. So he recognized early in his life that women were just as smart and should have just as many rights as men. And frustrated as a young man when he saw that his mother had so many things to overcome in terms of trying to manage property and gain wealth for herself and raise her family without a man being present. So, next slide. This is another thing that he's pretty well known for, was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And the reason that he's put at the top of that thing is everybody in Congress recognizes how quick he is and what a great lawyer he is. And so they said, you know, this is the guy, if we're going after the president, this is the guy we want to have leading that fight for us. And Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans loved him because of his stance on civil rights and women's suffrage and a lot of progressive issues of the day. So he became the de facto leader of the House prosecution of Andrew Johnson, which was basically based upon Johnson relieving Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. So he put together a pretty effective case. Matter went to the Senate, and Johnson was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate. So he came within a whisker of removing Andrew Johnson as President of the United States. Not a small accomplishment, frankly. Next slide. After that, he runs for governor several times, finally wins governor 1882. Of course, Beast Butler, right? He still has that haunting him. This is the cartoon that was run in the New York Herald, and this is baby Massachusetts over here, and that's, you know, the Beast. Now it's the governor taking it over, right? So, but he was a big person in terms of supporting reform, big on terms of reform and competence in state government. Again, you know, some things never change. But he insisted that people that served in their positions be honest and competent, primarily competent and then honest. But some of the things that he did, though, while he was governor, he appointed the first Irish-American judge in Massachusetts, the first African-American judge in Massachusetts, the first woman to executive office, which was Clara Barton. We talked about that. He did an in-depth plunge into the management of the state poorhouses. Down here in the South End, I don't know if people know where the poorhouse used to be, over here, but the state used to have poorhouses and orphanages, and a lot of them were very poorly run. They were sort of regarded as something that wasn't, we didn't pay, throw some money at them, keep the people alive, don't really make them nice. You don't want to have anything that might want to make people stay. So he went in there, he found out that there was a lot of mismanagement and outright thievery of funds that were intended to serve the poor in Massachusetts. And so a lot of people that ran these places were fired, and he brought in people that were competent and able to appropriately manage the funds placed in their stead. And he did all of this in 1 year. Governor's terms were a single year back then. Could you imagine? It must have been a constant campaign all the time. But anyways, he served his one term as governor in Massachusetts, and then he lost to George Robinson because there was a whole bunch of folks that got together to oppose Butler for appointing Irish to the bench and appointing African Americans to the bench and putting women in executive offices. There was a great deal of prejudice and bias against those positions. And of course, whenever you're firing people who have worked for the state for a long time, you're going to get people that are not going to like you for that, because each one of the people that he fired all had their own constituency. So they did a remarkable job, and they ended up going after Butler, and they beat him. I think it was about 10,000 votes out of about 350,000 cast. So it was pretty close, but he was gone after that. And one of the things I didn't know that he did, and I'm going to mention this to Charlie Baker when I see him, is that's who established the Lone Walk. And his final day in the State House, he closed the door, walked out the front door, and then walked down the long walkway past the hooker entrance and everything, and onto the street to assume his position back amongst the people that he served. And every governor since then, at the end of their term, has done that and walked out with the lone walk down by themselves to return to the people. 1884, he decides, you know what, I've got nothing else going on, so why don't I run for president? He runs as a greenback candidate because he favors use of paper currency, means that money will get down into more people's hands, and it's a good thing, but a little early for many people to sign. And obviously he does not win. Next slide. Later years, everybody's writing all of their memoirs, and Butler decides, well, I've got to write my memoir. And he wrote a book which was actually pretty well received, but several of his compatriots who had served with him, one of them said, "It's generally true without being meticulously accurate." Which I said, okay, that's a good way to sort of saying the guy was blowing his horn on stuff. But it's well written, but it is a tome. It's many pages, and when he passed, he ended up having, I think it was several 100,000 letters and documents that he had accrued over his career that scholars have used today. He dies on January 11th in 1893 from a bronchial infection, just 2 days after arguing yet another case before the Supreme Court. So he was active right up until the end of his life. Fascinating individual. Again, I think if you can take out the military aspects of his career and look more at what he did in terms of innovation, in terms of his organizational skills and his organizational abilities, he was a good general, and probably one of our best political general in my estimation. But he probably should not have been a guy that was put in charge of active command of combat troops. And he would have been great in terms of serving in a staff position as a senior chief of staff or something of that nature, but should not probably have been. It's a good example, I guess, of what they call the Peter principle, where you're promoted to your level of incompetence. And that's what happened with Ben. He got promoted to the level of incompetence, and it was readily apparent every time that he went into a battle, with the exception of the Cape Hatteras campaign. Every time he led troops into battle, not a good thing. He didn't inspire his subordinates, which is why the two corps commanders failed to rise and help him during the big Bermuda campaign. So sort of a victim of his own self. But I found him to be a fascinating individual, much more to him than what you've been led to believe if you just read the quick articles about Beast Butler stealing silverware in New Orleans. A lot more to Ben Butler than that. I think in the pantheon of great Americans, he deserves to be up there for a lot of reasons. Primarily his support of many of the progressive causes that we talked about earlier today that we take for granted. He was an early advocate for civil rights, for women's suffrage, and for a lot of those things that are part of our society today. Next page. So his legacy: he was a demagogue, speculator, military bungler, and sharp legal practitioner. He was all of these, but he was also a fearless advocate for the downtrodden, a resourceful military administrator, and an astonishing innovator. While some of his activities were dubious at best, and there are plenty of examples of that, he was a strong critic of Southern terrorism and a solid advocate for civil rights and women's suffrage. So if you want to remember Ben Butler, that probably would give you a more thorough understanding of him and his career, other than somebody who was looting silverware out of New Orleans, which seems to be what most people come to mind when they hear that. Next slide. These are two great books, and I've got them here tonight. This one is by Elizabeth Leonard that just came out, which is really good. Quick, easy read, probably a couple of days. I read it, and then this one was funny. This talks about a lot of the rumors and things that went about Butler unvarnished, but it's called Benjamin Butler, the damnedest Yankee. And in a lot of respects, he probably was. So, subject to your questions.
Where was he buried?
He's buried in a place called Edge Hill up in Lowell, behind his family, his wife's family's home. There's a small cemetery there. I think I know this one. Yeah, and there he is. So, not much of a looker, but a very sharp guy, and honestly, a thorough patriot. He was a Democrat, and when he realized that the Democratic Party was going this way, he said, "I'm no longer a Democrat," and he came over and he became a Republican because he loved his country more than he loved his party, which I think he should be admired for. Any other questions?
So his congressional district was up in Lowell?
Yes. Yep. He lived most of his life in Lowell, and he was unappreciated there. He had a beautiful home, which you can imagine somebody with $240 million would have a nice home. He had a beautiful home. It fell into disrepair, and it was one of those things that caught fire and burned down, and so it no longer exists. There are postcards that you could actually see what it looked like. And people that visited it were very impressed. He had a great sense of taste.
So when he died, he was in the DC area, he argued in front of the Supreme Court, right? He died in Washington, or?
No, when he died in Washington, but they were able to transmit his body. Yeah, the question was where did he die, and he died in DC, but they were able to transport his body back to Lowell for burial. But it's like similar to Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln died and finally got buried was about 3 weeks later. So, given the embalming techniques of the day, his burial was rather quick. It was probably about a week after he died, but did pretty well. Other questions, Dave?
Hey Jeff, any evidence that he had any direct contact with Lincoln?
Yes, he did. The question was, did he have direct contact with Lincoln? Yes, he did. He met with Lincoln several times during Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln regarded him warily. This was a guy that could do a lot of damage to him, particularly before he was reelected. So he said, we have to find a place because it's better to have him on the inside of the tent spitting out and on the outside of the tent spitting in. And Lincoln was very aware of Butler's popularity with people in the North, and that he could marshal some significant opposition if he needed to. So he treated him with kid gloves and treated him courteously and kind, and admired him in certain respects for coming up with some of the things that he did. His interesting legal argument on contraband. Lincoln sort of kind of said, that's a smart fellow to come up with that quickly. So, anything else? What is this, an audience or an oil painting? Thank you very much.